Imagine this. You wake up in the middle of the night. The air temperature is 50 degrees below zero. The wind cuts like a blade. There are no concrete walls, no heater, no synthetic sleeping bag, no modern thermal clothing, no matches, no lighter, no electricity, just ice, just darkness, just the constant howl of the Arctic. That would kill anyone unprepared. Right. But the peoples of the Arctic, Inuit, Yupik, Inupiat, did this for millennia. Not for one night, not for a camera-documented week-long expedition, for entire generations. Children were born in these conditions. Elders survived for decades. Whole families crossed winters that lasted months without seeing the sun. And they slept on ice. No wool blankets. No insulation technology you'd buy at an outdoor gear store. None of the items any modern survival guide would list as essential. So what kept them alive? It wasn't magic. It wasn't some special genetic adaptation that made them immune to cold. It wasn't luck accumulated over centuries. It was engineering. It was systematic knowledge built and refined over hundreds of generations, passed from parent to child, with the precision of people who know that one mistake kills. It was a system so sophisticated that the greatest thermodynamics experts of the 20th century were stunned when they finally studied what these peoples had created. And the question that will drive everything that follows is this: what truly kept these people alive? The architecture of the shelter, the control of their own bodies, or the collective behavioral protocol? What's your guess? Comment right now and we'll test it throughout the video, because the answer will surprise you, and it will change the way you think about survival, about engineering, and about what it truly means to know the environment where you live. Survival in the Arctic doesn't begin when the storm arrives. It begins weeks before.
The wind shifts here right before
sometimes
a storm.
months before.
See how the snow
before the
gathers
first
on that
snowflake
ridge.
of the new season.
You must read the
before
tracks,
the first
not just see
completely
them.
dark night. Before the first roar of wind that announces the real winter. Because in the Arctic, whoever waits for danger to appear before reacting has already arrived too late. The peoples who lived in this region for millennia understood something that most modern cultures have still not internalized. Survival is a decision made when danger is still far away. It is cold mathematics, calculated with a cold head before the heat of panic distorts judgment. The first calculation was location. Choosing where to build was not a matter of preference. It was a matter of physics. Terrain that was too elevated exposed the structure to wind. Terrain that was too low created snow accumulation in unpredictable patterns. The wrong slope by a few degrees determined whether the spring thaw would turn the ground into a trap or a safe passage. Orientation mattered. An entrance facing the wrong direction relative to the prevailing wind would mean a temperature difference of 10 to 15 degrees inside the shelter. 10 degrees in the Arctic is the difference between waking up in the morning and not waking up at all. The type of snow mattered even more than the location. This shocks outsiders. For most people, snow is snow, but the Inuit had dozens of words to describe different types of snow, not for poetry, but out of technical necessity. The right snow for construction had a specific density. Blocks cut from the wrong layer simply crumbled under pressure or failed to seal the joints properly. The choice was made by probing the ground with a rod, assessing resistance, checking cohesion. An experienced builder could determine snow quality in seconds. An inexperienced one could spend hours cutting blocks that would be useless. The time of day construction began was also calculated. Building during the coldest hours made the process slower and more dangerous for the workers. But building during the relatively less cold hours could soften the snow enough to compromise the stability of the first blocks before they set. There was a right window, narrow, known only by those who had learned from those who had learned from those who had learned. And there was one criterion that almost no outsider notices. The size of the shelter was calculated based on the exact number of people who would inhabit it. Not larger, not smaller. An igloo built for 5 people, inhabited by 2, was a problem. Too much internal air volume meant the bodies couldn't heat the environment efficiently. A shelter for 2 people, tight, was safer than one for 5, spacious. Human heat was the engine of the system, and the engine needed to be correctly sized for the volume it was heating. Each of these decisions carried a risk, a response, a consequence, and all of them were made before the storm arrived. Now comes the part that modern engineers study with astonishment. The igloo is not a primitive snow hut built because no other material was available. The igloo is thermodynamics disguised as simplicity. It is physics applied with mastery by people who never heard the word physics, but who understood its principles better than many university graduates. The first element is the shape. The dome is not merely aesthetically interesting, it is structurally efficient. The arch distributes weight in a way that no flat wall can replicate. This means that relatively fragile snow blocks, arranged in an ascending spiral and slightly tilted inward, create a structure that supports its own weight and the weight of snow accumulated externally. No individual block carries the load alone. The tension is distributed by the geometry. It is the same principle as medieval Gothic cathedrals, only executed thousands of years earlier with a material that melts. The second element is the variable wall thickness. It is not uniform, the base is thicker. The top, where internal heat naturally concentrates, is thinner. Why? Because heat rises. The warm air produced by bodies and by any internal heat source accumulates at the top. If the walls at the top were as thick as those at the base, the accumulated heat would melt the interior faster than the external cold could refreeze it. The thinner walls at the top allow a controlled release of heat, maintaining thermal balance without structural collapse. It's like the double-pane window of a modern house. The double layer doesn't eliminate heat exchange, it regulates it. The igloo does the same thing, only with variable thickness instead of composite materials. The third element is the entrance. It is never vertical, always a top, always curving downward before rising. This specific geometry uses a simple principle. Cold air is denser and heavier than warm air. It tends to accumulate near the floor. The curved entrance, with its lowest point below the internal floor of the igloo, creates a trap for cold air. Wind entering through the entrance descends, hits the lowest point of the tunnel, and cannot rise with enough force to invade the habitable space. The warm air inside naturally rises and is retained in the dome. The separation between the two environments is maintained almost automatically by physics. No door, no seal, just geometry. The fourth element is the ventilation system. There is a small hole at the top of the igloo, too small to seem important, but that hole is critical. Without it, human breathing and any internal combustion source would cause carbon dioxide to accumulate to the point of incapacitating the inhabitants. With it, the natural chimney effect. Warm, contaminated air rising and exiting through the top. Fresher air drawn in through the entrance creates a constant passive circulation. This is exactly the principle that contemporary architects apply in high-performance buildings. Natural ventilation through temperature difference, without electricity, without mechanical fans. The Inuit solved the same problem with a little hole. The fifth element is the interior lining. Animal skins were hung on the interior walls, separated from the snow by a small air gap. That gap was not accidental. It worked as additional insulation. The layer of stagnant air between the skin and the snow is one of the best thermal insulators nature offers. It is the same principle as modern multi-layer clothing, but it also had a secondary function. The skin absorbed condensed moisture before it could refreeze in the walls and create structural cracks. But here comes the problem. The heat generated by the bodies inside the igloo was enough to raise the internal temperature to surprisingly comfortable levels, 0 degrees or slightly above, while the exterior registered 50 below. But that same heat slightly melted the interior surface of the snow walls, and the meltwater needed somewhere to go. The solution was elegant and non-obvious. The igloo floor was built on 2 levels. The platform where people slept and sat was elevated relative to the entrance level. Meltwater drained toward the lower part of the floor, near the entrance, where the temperature was low enough to refreeze before accumulating. The spatial geometry managed water passively, without a pump, without a drain, without active human effort. The sixth element is the lamp. The kulik, the soapstone lamp fueled by animal fat, was the heart of the system. Small, controllable, positioned with precision, not by chance, always at a point that maximized heat circulation without creating localized hotspots that could compromise the structural integrity of the nearest walls. The lamp heated, illuminated, and served to melt snow into drinking water. 3 critical functions, 1 energy source, and the fuel, seal or whale fat, had an extraordinary energy density for the volume and weight carried. But the engineering of the shelter was only half the system. The other half was the people inside it. Surviving in the Arctic was not a matter of building a good shelter and then resting. It was a continuous protocol, executed with discipline, repeated until it became reflex. The Arctic night in winter can last months. That is not a metaphor. It is literal. And inside those long nights, the group within the igloo organized itself into routines that seemed cultural, but were at their core operational. Sleeping positions were not random. People with smaller body mass, usually children, were positioned at the center of the sleeping platform, surrounded by those with larger mass. The adults functioned as outer layers of thermal insulation, protecting the most vulnerable members. There were no blankets in the modern sense, but there was collective heat managed spatially. Clothing was removed before sleeping. That seems suicidal. It is counterintuitive in the extreme. But there is precise logic here. Clothes wet from the day's sweat kill. Sweat freezes. Freezing creates hypothermia from the inside out, much harder to reverse than external cold. The clothes were removed, shaken to remove moisture, and placed near the lamp's heat to dry slightly during the night. Sleeping in the wet clothes of the day would be trading manageable cold for a cold that penetrates the body's deepest layers without warning. But here's the detail almost no one notices. The clothes were placed in a specific position at the igloo exit, not inside, not outside, but in the entrance tunnel itself. That positioning was not for lack of space. It was so that upon waking, the clothes would be at an intermediate temperature. Putting them on too cold would cause a thermal shock the body would take hours to compensate for. Putting them on inside the warm igloo and then stepping outside meant the absorbed heat would dissipate in seconds. The entrance tunnel was a zone of intermediate temperature, and the clothes stored there naturally pre-warmed before morning use. It was a transition chamber, like the pressure vestibule of an industrial clean room, only made of snow. Now the dilemma. The igloo could get too warm. When the whole group was inside with the lamp burning, the internal temperature rose, and with it came sweat. Sweat in sleeping clothes was fatal. Sweat on the igloo walls accelerated structural melting. But ventilating too much to control the heat meant throwing away thermal energy that had taken hours to accumulate. And in the Arctic, wasted energy is wasted lifetime. The solution was to calibrate the lamp with near-surgical precision, turn it up slightly before sleep to raise the temperature, reduce it to the functional minimum during sleeping hours, wake at intervals to check the state of the walls, the air temperature, the condensation level. There was always someone awake, not out of paranoia, but by protocol. The group took turns on night watches, not to defend against predators, though that was also real, but to monitor the physical environment of the shelter. A crack in the wrong block, an unexpected drip, a shift in the wind pattern increasing pressure on a particular wall. The night monitor was the igloo's systems analyst, but not everything threatening survival came from the climate. The Arctic has predators. The polar bear is not a creature that keeps a respectful distance from humans it recognizes as technologically superior. It is an active, intelligent predator, observed following human tracks for miles and investigating shelters with surgical patience. And then there were other human groups. The Arctic was not a peaceful, isolated paradise. There was competition for hunting territories, for scarce resources, for migration routes. Conflicts existed, nighttime attacks existed. The response was not a security system in the conventional military sense. It was architectural and behavioral at the same time. The tunnel entrance of the igloo, the one that appeared to be merely a solution for the cold, had a second purpose. Any person entering had to crouch, diminish themselves, expose their head and shoulders in a vulnerable position for several seconds. Any person inside the igloo awake had both time and positional advantage over any intruder. The sound of ice and snow being compressed by the steps of a bear or a human being propagated differently depending on the type of terrain. People with decades of Arctic experience could distinguish those sounds during sleep and wake with the appropriate level of alertness for each type of threat. The dogs, and groups like the Inuit had sled dogs as a central part of the survival system, slept in the tunnel entrance or near it, not inside, not far away. At the exact point where they would detect approach before it became critical, but where their body heat also contributed to the temperature of the transition chamber. Every element of the system had at least 2 functions, sometimes 3. It was layers of defense reinforcing each other, not independent systems. Removing any one of them not only eliminated that specific function, it weakened all the others. Do you remember the question from the beginning? What truly kept these people alive? The architecture of the shelter? The control of their own bodies? Or the collective behavioral protocol? The answer is that none of the 3 worked alone, and that the 3 together were something greater than the sum of their parts. The igloo architecture was brilliant, but without the correct bodily protocols, dry clothing, sleep positioning, sweat management, the most perfect shelter in the world would save no one. A group of untrained people inside a perfect igloo would die of hypothermia for not understanding why they cannot sleep in wet clothes. The bodily protocol was essential, but without proper architecture, the human body simply does not generate enough heat to survive 50-degree sacs in open conditions, no matter how disciplined the behavior. You can have the most rigorous protocol in the world and die within hours without a correctly designed shelter. Collective behavior was critical, but without architecture and bodily protocol, the most disciplined and cohesive group in the world would merely be dying in an organized fashion. It was an integrated system, where each element depended on the others to function. Remove one pillar, the other 2 collapse, and this is what distinguishes ancestral knowledge from folklore. It is not a collection of tricks, it is an architecture of interdependencies built through trial, error and death, refined over centuries until reaching an efficiency no modern engineer could surpass working with the same materials. Think about your own life now. What system do you depend on without knowing it? What interdependency have you never stopped to map? What protocol do you execute without understanding why it exists, and that you would stop executing if you didn't understand the consequence? What Arctic peoples knew and what modernity frequently forgets is that it is not about mastering one technique. It is about building a system, and systems do not tolerate gaps. The external temperature could vary by decades of difference. Available materials changed with the season and the territory. Group members varied in number, in health, in experience. But the central principle never changed. Every element must reinforce the others. Every decision must serve more than one function, and the system as a whole must be more resilient than any of its individual parts. That is why these cultures survived for millennia in an environment that kills well-equipped modern explorers within hours. It was not strength. It was not superhuman endurance. It was systemic engineering, transmitted through generations as a living survival code, continuously updated by the relentless pressure of the environment. And this is where everything changes, when you realize this principle is not specific to the Arctic, it is universal. The company that survives crises is not the one with the best isolated technology. It is the one that built a system where process, culture, and structure reinforce each other. The athlete who lasts for decades is not the one with the best training program. It is the one who integrated training, recovery, and nutrition into a system where each element serves the others. The family that crosses decades of adversity is not the richest or the most educated. It is the one where communication, distribution of responsibilities, and emotional support form an interdependent system. The Inuit sleeping on ice at 50 degrees C with no blankets were not merely survivors. They were first-class systems engineers, and the lesson they left behind doesn't fit in a survival manual. It fits in a single principle. Integrated systems overcome extreme conditions. Isolated techniques die with them. There are more forgotten techniques like this one. Water purification systems developed by desert peoples that modern engineers still study. Food preservation methods from Andean cultures that the food industry tried to replicate at industrial scale and failed. Ocean navigation techniques from Polynesian peoples that use currents, stars, and wave behavior in ways that GPS cannot fully replace. Each of these systems was built by the same process: extreme pressure, generations of refinement, rigorous transmission, and a deep understanding that survival is not an event, it is an architecture. In the next videos, we will take these systems apart one by one. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next.